She was 76 years old, carrying groceries home from the same store she had walked to every Tuesday for 31 years. Officer Dale Pruett saw a black grandmother alone on a sidewalk and made the easiest decision of his morning. He grabbed her canvas cart, twisted her arm behind her back with the practiced ease of a man who had done this too many times, and took Estelle Mae Burgess, 76 years old, 138 pounds, arthritic wrists, a heart that had never known anything but love for other people, down to the concrete of a public sidewalk. When her groceries scattered and she cried out in pain, he laughed. He thought she was a safe target. He had chosen wrong in a way that was about to cost him everything, because Estelle Mae Burgess had one phone call to make. And her son, Colonel Marcus Burgess of Delta Force, a man who had hunted warlords in places Dale Pruett had never heard of, who had spent 29 years doing the things that keep this country safe in ways that never appear in newspapers, was already in his car before the call ended. This is the story of what happens when a small-town machine built on silence meets a man whose entire career was spent dismantling machines exactly like it. And it starts with a woman carrying butterbeans and a receipt that a coward refused to read. There are people who exist at the center of a community without ever asking to be placed there. They don't seek the spotlight or run for office or put their names on buildings. They simply live day after day with a particular consistency and warmth that makes the people around them quietly better and the world around them quietly more whole. Estelle Mae Burgess was that kind of person. And Clanton, Georgia knew it, even if Clanton's police department had not bothered to find out. She was 76 years old and had lived on Calder Road for 41 years in the same white clapboard house she had shared with her late husband Gerald until his passing 8 years prior. The house was modest. She repainted it herself every 4 years because she believed a home deserved that kind of attention, with a covered front porch holding 2 rocking chairs older than most of her neighbors' children, and a side yard garden that produced tomatoes so abundantly every summer that she spent half of August giving them away in paper bags to anyone willing to take them. She owned nothing extravagant. She had built her life from something more durable than possessions. For 34 years, Estelle Mae Burgess stood in a 3rd-grade classroom at Clanton Elementary School and taught children how to read. Stated plainly, that is what she did. But there is nothing plain about what it actually means to stand in front of a room full of 8-year-olds, year after year, decade after decade, and give them the key that unlocks every door they will ever want to open. She taught 312 students over her career. She knew the number because she kept a handwritten ledger, 1 entry per student, their name, the year, and something particular she had noticed about them, because she believed every child deserved to be noticed for something particular and irreplaceable. Those students were grown now. They were lawyers and nurses and electricians and soldiers and store owners and mothers and fathers and grandparents themselves. They still sent her Christmas cards. They still drove back to Clanton with their own children and said with the specific reverence that adults rarely extend to anyone. This is the woman who taught me how to read. 2 of her former students taught on the Clanton City Council. 1 ran the emergency room at Clanton Regional Medical. 1 drove a delivery truck for a regional supply company and was, as it would turn out, parked in exactly the right place on the worst morning of Estelle Burgess's long and decent life. She sang soprano in the choir at Greater Refuge Baptist Church every Sunday without fail. The choir director called her voice the kind that made you believe the words were actually true. She made the best sweet potato pie in 3 counties and would tell you so herself, not out of arrogance, but out of the confidence of a woman who knew what she was good at and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She brought that pie to every church potluck, every neighborhood gathering, every family in Clanton that had experienced a death or a new baby or a particularly hard season, because she believed a good meal delivered to someone's door was one of the most direct forms of love available. She had raised 1 child largely alone. Her husband Gerald's heart condition limited him through most of Marcus's teenage years, doing it on a teacher's salary with the same methodical and unsentimental grace she applied to everything in her life. Her son had become a soldier, a decorated, exceptional, genuinely dangerous soldier, the kind the country creates in very small numbers and deploys in very specific places. She was proud of him in a way too deep to be described simply as pride. It was more like recognition. She had known since he was very small that Marcus Burgess was made of something particular. She had simply done her best to make sure the world got the use of it. She was in every meaningful sense unbreakable. They were about to try anyway. The morning of the incident was a Tuesday in late August, the kind that arrives in Georgia, wrapped in heat, so thick and damp, it feels like the air itself is trying to hold you still. Estelle was up at 6, as she had been every morning for as long as she could remember, because she believed the first hours of the day belonged to a person in a way the rest of the day didn't. She made her coffee in the old percolator that had been on her counter since 1989, stood at the kitchen window while it brewed, and watched the light change on the oak tree in the side yard, the one Gerald had planted the year Marcus was born, now wider around than she could reach, casting shade across half the garden in the afternoon. Coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of whole milk. The gospel hour on the radio. A habit so old it was indistinguishable from the morning itself. She gathered her canvas tote bags from the hook by the front door. 3 of them, different shades of green, faded from use in the way that good things go soft rather than apart, and loaded them into the fold-up cart she kept in the hall closet. She had one item she always added when shopping on a Tuesday, a bag of dried butter beans. Marcus's particular preference, the specific brand she'd been buying since he was 17, and had announced with great seriousness that Beaumont's store-brand butter beans were the only acceptable ones. He was 53 years old, a decorated Army colonel who'd deployed to places whose names she wasn't allowed to know, and she still bought his butter beans every Tuesday. He came home twice a year if she was lucky. She kept his corner of the pantry stocked the way all mothers keep some small designated space for the children who have grown and gone, holding it ready with the particular faith that they will come back. She also gathered items for Earl Simmons, her neighbor across the street. Earl was 81, a retired deacon who had driven Estelle to the hospital the night Gerald's heart first failed and sat in the waiting room until 4 in the morning without being asked. His arthritis had progressed to the point where walking distances had become unreliable, and so Estelle had, without announcing it or making anything of it, simply incorporated him into her weekly shop. She bought what he needed and delivered it on her way back. Earl accepted this with the dignity of a man who understood that receiving help graciously was its own form of generosity. She tucked the receipt from last week into her coat pocket, the left breast pocket, always the left where she always put it. She had kept every grocery receipt for 43 years. It had started as household accounting, the careful tracking of a woman raising a child on a teacher's salary, and it had stayed long after the necessity passed. There was another reason, one she didn't often talk about when she was 32. A store clerk in Augusta had accused her of not paying for a bag of rice. She had paid. She had her receipt. The clerk had not apologized. She had carried the lesson of that afternoon. For 44 years, document everything. Keep every piece of paper, give no one a reason, and still understand that some people will find one anyway. She pulled on her beige overcoat, checked that the front door was locked, and began the 6-block walk to Beaumont's grocery. Her doctor said the walking was good for her joints. She would have done it anyway. She did her shopping with the efficiency of long-practiced collard greens, butter, the butter beans, tea bags, the items for Earl. Sandra at the register, 11 years on the Tuesday morning shift, told Estelle her hydrangeas were beautiful. Estelle said she'd bring sweet potato pie on Saturday. She folded her receipt in half, tucked it into the left breast pocket of her coat, loaded the bags into the cart, and began the walk home. She was 3.5 blocks from her front door when the cruiser appeared. She heard the engine before she saw the car, the deliberate slowing of a police cruiser alongside a pedestrian, a quality of attention different from ordinary passing traffic. Estelle Mae Burgess, with 76 years of life experience and decades in the American South, recognized it immediately. She kept walking. She had no reason to stop. The window came down. "Hey!" The voice was flat and requiring the kind accustomed to not asking twice. "Hey you! Where are you going?" She turned. The driver was a large man, not tall but dense in the way of a man who had once been athletic and let that athleticism harden into something less flexible. Thick-necked face, the permanent red of sustained anger rather than momentary flush. His uniform was wrinkled at the collar, his sleeves slightly stretched. His nameplate read Pruett. In the passenger seat sat a much younger officer, 22, 23, with a face that hadn't finished settling into itself, watching the exchange with an expression caught between compliance and discomfort. "I'm walking home," Estelle said. Her voice was calm. She had encountered officers like Dale Pruett before. "You did not reach 76 years of age as a black woman in the state of Georgia without learning how to hold yourself still in the presence of that particular kind of danger." "There's been a report," Pruett said with the smoothness of a man who had used this opening many times, of shoplifting in the area, matching your description. Estelle stood on the sidewalk with her canvas cart and her groceries and her receipt in her breast pocket, and felt a whole catalog of things in rapid succession. Surprise, the specific humiliation of it, the practiced calm she had learned to deploy in exactly these moments. And beneath all of it, something she took a moment to name. It was the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent 76 years being exactly who she is, exactly as good as she has been, and still finding herself standing on a sidewalk, being called a thief by a man who has not asked her a single question. "Excuse me," she said. "Step over to the curb, ma'am. I have my receipt right here." She began reaching into her breast pocket, slowly, deliberately, her movements telegraphed and careful. "I have every receipt from Beaumont's. The items in this cart were purchased by me this morning, approximately 20 minutes ago. Sandra was my cashier. You can call the store." I said, "Step over to the curb." She stepped. She held out the receipt. Pruett did not look at it. He didn't glance at it. He watched her hand extend toward him, with the folded piece of paper, the documentation that made the accusation impossible, and he looked at it with the specific curiosity of a man who has already decided what the truth is and does not require evidence to the contrary. "You know what that receipt tells me?" Pruett said, leaning his forearm on the window frame, his eyes moving over her with the loose assessment of someone confirming a narrative rather than gathering information. "It tells me you knew you'd need it. Guilty people always save receipts." He said it with a thin, practiced smile, not the smile of a man who found something funny, but the smile of a man who enjoyed watching a reaction land. The words settled on the morning air, like something dropped into still water. Estelle felt the ripple of it, the specific grinding ugliness of logic that could not be escaped because it was not logic at all. It was a trap, the kind where any response becomes evidence. She held herself very still. "I would like to know the nature of the complaint," she said carefully, "and I would like to speak with your supervisor." Pruett opened his car door and got out. He was larger standing than he'd appeared behind the wheel. He walked around the front of the cruiser and positioned himself directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "My supervisor's name," he said, low and flat, "is not something you need right now. What you need is to stop asking questions and start following instructions. Are we clear?" "We are not clear," Estelle said quietly, "because you have not told me what I am accused of, and I have produced documentation that I have done nothing wrong." She held the receipt out again. He still didn't look at it. The young officer, his nameplate read, Corley, got out of the passenger side. He stood by the hood of the cruiser and said nothing. His hands hung at his sides. He was watching the collard greens in the top of Estelle's bag and not meeting anyone's eyes. Across the street, Travis Holcomb was sitting in the cab of his delivery truck eating a sandwich and checking an order manifest on his phone. He drove for Whitfield Regional Supplies, cleaning products and paper goods to restaurants and small businesses across a 4-county area. 52 years old, broad-shouldered, from 20 years of loading and unloading kind eyes behind wire-framed glasses, a Georgia Bulldogs cap he'd owned since his daughter was in high school. His dashcam was running the way it always ran because he'd been rear-ended twice in 7 years and learned his lesson. Good unit, high definition. Cloud upload every 6 hours, automatic. He wasn't paying close attention to the sidewalk interaction. He noticed it the way you notice anything at the edge of your peripheral vision, something happening registered, returned to. He was checking his manifest. Then he heard her cry out and he looked up. Pruett had stepped forward and grabbed Estelle's canvas cart. Not to assist, not with any gesture toward helpfulness, he seized the handlebar and yanked it sideways, pulling it out of alignment with her grip. Her hand went with it, the way any hand goes when something is pulled from its grasp automatically, physically, the pure mechanics of holding something you are in the process of losing. He interpreted the reach as resistance. He grabbed her arm. He twisted it behind her back with the practiced leveraged force of a man who had done this many times, the specific efficiency of repetition, and he took her to the ground. She went down hard. No gentleness, no effort to control the fall or minimize its impact. Her knees hit the concrete with a sound Travis Holcomb would describe to investigators as a sound that should not be allowed to happen. She cried out one sharp, involuntary sound, the sound a person makes when pain is sudden and total. Her palms scraped the sidewalk as her hands went out to catch herself. She caught herself partially. The impact came anyway, jarring through her wrists and knees and hip. Her 76-year-old bones taking the weight of a fall she had not chosen and could not fully absorb. The canvas cart hit the sidewalk and tipped. One of the bags caught the edge of the curb and split along the bottom seam. The groceries spilled the butter, the tea bags, the items for Earl. The bag of dried butter beans. Marcus's butter beans, the ones she bought every Tuesday, because she kept his corner of the pantry ready, rolled out of the torn bag, bounced twice against the concrete, and came to rest in the gutter against a wet leaf. Estelle was still trying to speak, trying to say she was complying. She had always been complying. She had done nothing. The words came out thin and broken, because she was in pain, and because Dale Pruett had placed his knee against her upper back, pressing her into the sidewalk, reaching for his handcuffs. The cuffs clicked shut around her wrists, steel against arthritic joints. Too tight, one notch too far, the way a man does when he wants to make a point rather than make an arrest. She did not scream. She made herself not scream because she had learned a long time ago that screaming gave men like this exactly what they wanted. She compressed the pain into something smaller and held it there and kept her face as still as she could make it. Shane Corley stood beside the cruiser and did not move. Shane Corley was 22 years old, 8 months on the Clanton PD, hired straight out of the academy in Macon. He was not a bad person. He was a young person who had not yet developed the courage to act on the difference between not being bad and being good, and that difference is exactly as large as it looks and larger. He stood beside the passenger door and watched Dale Pruett take Estelle Mae Burgess to the ground. He watched her cry out. He watched her palms scrape the concrete. He watched the groceries scatter. He watched the butter beans roll into the gutter and stop against a wet leaf in the drain. He stood there with his hand on his belt and his eyes on the sidewalk, and he did not move. 3 bystanders stopped. A woman with a stroller, a man in a work shirt heading toward a parked truck, an older man who started walking toward the scene and then stopped making the calculation that people make when they are afraid of the thing they are watching. All 3 of them took out phones. Pruett didn't care about the phones. He had never cared about phones. In Clanton under Glenn Varner, nothing had ever come of phones before. Estelle was loaded into the back of the cruiser. The groceries for Earl Simmons remained on the sidewalk. Her receipt, the proof that made everything she had said demonstrably true, the piece of paper she had held out twice to an officer who had twice refused to look at it, was flat against the concrete under the front tire. As Pruett pulled out and drove toward the station, the tire rolled off it, leaving it folded in half on the sidewalk. Still legible, still correct, meaning nothing. Shane Corley got into the passenger seat and said nothing for the entire drive. The Clanton Police Department sat on Commerce Street in a single-story brick building constructed in 1974, lasted significantly updated in 2003. The lobby smelled of floor cleaner and the specific quality of recycled air that never quite loses the smell of the people who have passed through it. Estelle was brought in through the side entrance and placed in the processing area, a room with 2 plastic chairs bolted to the wall and a metal bench along one side. Her phone was taken. They called it standard procedure. It was not standard procedure. It was deliberate because a phone is a resource, and removing resources from a person you have detained is one of the ways you remind them of their position. She sat in the plastic chair with her hands in her lap, her knees throbbing, her wrists aching at both joints where the cuffs had been. She asked for gauze twice before someone brought it. She waited. At 11:14 in the morning, she heard Dale Pruett's voice from the break room down the hall. She could not hear every word. She heard enough. She heard him say belligerent. She heard him say combative. She heard him describe in the casual tone of a man telling a story, rather than reporting facts, that the woman on Calder Road had lost her balance when detained, and that officers had attempted to assist. She heard the other officers laugh, short, unconcerned, the laugh of someone for whom this kind of story is entirely familiar. Then she heard something that made her go very still inside. 70-some-year-old woman giving me actual lip about probable cause. Pruett's voice easy and amused. "You believe that? Had to put her down just so she'd listen. Then she's asking for my supervisor's name like she's going to do something about it." A pause. The sound of a chair shifting. "These people, man, they read one thing on the internet, and they think a piece of paper means something out there." The other officer laughed again, longer this time. Estelle filed every word away. She was a woman who had spent 34 years in a profession where you paid careful attention to what children revealed when they thought no one important was listening. She had learned that the unguarded moments told you everything you needed to know. Chief Glenn Varner arrived at the station at approximately 11:40. He was 61 years old, heavy-set silver hair cut close, a face built around a permanent expression of measured managerial calm. He had been chief of police for 22 years and moved through the building with the comfortable authority of a man in his own house. He called Pruett into his office and closed the door. What happened in that office? The conversation, the specific instructions, the specific language used to transform what the dashcam would show into something manageable, would not become fully public for weeks. But the substance of it was Varner told Pruett to release Estelle without charges. The incident report would reflect that she had appeared unsteady on her feet, lost her balance, and officers had attempted to assist a citizen in apparent distress. The shoplifting report was unconfirmed, and the matter had been cleared. It would be handled. "And the dashcam on this cruiser," Pruett said. Varner looked at him without blinking. "Technical malfunction. Camera wasn't recording." Neither of them knew that the conversation they were having inside Varner's office with the door closed had been captured in its entirety. Not by a police system, not by a court order, by something already set in motion 3 blocks away on a front porch on Calder Road, by a man named Earl Simmons, who had noticed that Estelle hadn't walked past at her usual time and had started making calls, one of which was to his nephew Gregory, a man with information technology skills that neither Pruett nor Varner had considered in their calculations. Estelle was released at 1:47 in the afternoon. No charges, no explanation, no apology. A plastic bag containing her surviving groceries. Her receipt was not returned. The officer who walked her to the front steps would not meet her eyes. She stood on the steps in the late afternoon light, with the plastic bag and the gauze on her knees, and the particular weight of a woman who has been through something that should not have happened and knows she is not the first and will not be the last. She took out her phone. She called her son. Here is what Dale Pruett did not know about the woman he had put on the ground that morning, and here is why it mattered before he ever touched her. Estelle Mae Burgess's son was Colonel Marcus Burgess, 53 years old. United States Army assigned to the Special Operations Command at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. In official public affairs language, he was a senior officer in Special Operations Forces. In the language used by people who know what the words actually mean, he was a Delta Force commander, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta. The unit that handles the operations. Other special operations units cannot in places whose names are classified against threats the public would find frightening to know existed in the specific form they take. He was not large in the way that movie soldiers are large. He was 6 feet exactly, lean and precise, with close-cropped silver at his temples that had appeared when he was 38 and stayed. He had a stillness about him that was not passivity. It was the stillness of a man who has learned to conserve everything because everything may be required at any moment. People who met him for the first time frequently lowered their voices without knowing why. His colleagues, the men who had been beside him in terrible places, doing the things that cannot be described in newspapers, said he was the person you wanted making decisions when every available option was bad. He had served 29 years. He had deployed to countries he could not name publicly. He had conducted operations in environments where the air itself was trying to kill you. He had made decisions in fractions of seconds that determined whether the people with him lived or died, and the record showed he had made those decisions correctly in circumstances where the margin for error was absolute. He called his mother every Sunday after church. He had done this without exception for 21 years since the Sunday of his first deployment, when he borrowed a satellite phone from another soldier, and felt with a vividness that surprised him exactly how far from home he was and how much that mattered. Since that Sunday, he had never missed the call. He had called from 6 continents, from vehicles moving through environments he cannot describe, from hospital rooms and briefing rooms and locations without publicly acknowledged addresses. He had her photograph in his kit on every deployment, tucked behind his emergency documentation in the inner left pocket of his pack, where it had traveled with him to every place he had ever been sent. The one time he had been wounded through and through to the left shoulder. In a country he cannot name, in an operation that cannot be described, his first conscious thought in the medical bay before he had fully processed what had happened was that he needed to make sure his mother didn't hear about it from someone else. He had never in 53 years heard his mother cry. Marcus was in a debrief room at 1:23 in the afternoon, reviewing tactical documentation with 2 members of his team when his phone buzzed. He saw the name on the screen. He picked up immediately. He always did. "Mama," he said. "Hey, how are?" What he heard was not her voice, not the warm, rolling Georgia cadence he had known his entire life, the voice that had read to him and argued with him and laughed at him and loved him with a completeness he had spent decades trying to understand the dimensions of. What he heard was something else, thin and shaking. Compressed the specific quality of a person trying to hold themselves together in an environment where falling apart is not safe. He had heard this compression before in his work, in conversations with people who were trying to communicate without letting anyone nearby understand what was being said. He had never expected to hear it from her. "Baby," she whispered, and her voice broke slightly on the word. "They've got me at the police station. I didn't do anything. I was just walking home." The 2 members of his team in the debrief room that afternoon would later say they could see nothing on his face in that moment, which anyone who understands Delta operators knows is not a sign that nothing is happening. It is a sign that everything is happening, and that it has been directed somewhere very specific. "Are you hurt?" he said. "My knees," she said, "and my wrist, baby. They threw me down on the sidewalk. Are you safe right now? Are they keeping you? They say they haven't charged me with anything. They have me sitting here. Mama, listen to me. Don't sign anything. Don't answer anything else. If anyone asks you questions, you tell them you are waiting for your attorney. I'm going to make some calls and then I'm coming. Tonight. Okay. Raymond, you really don't have to come all this." "Mama," a pause. "Okay, baby." He hung up. He stood up from the debrief table. His teammate, Master Sergeant Devin Webb, looked up from his own paperwork and read Marcus's face the way you read weather patterns in a hostile environment, fast and carefully. "What happened?" "Someone put their hands on my mother." Devin set down his pen. "We're Clanton, Georgia. Local police." A pause. "You need backup." Marcus considered it for exactly 1 second. "Not yet," he said. He made 4 phone calls before he left the building. The first call was to Captain Jerome Willis, the unit's JAG officer, the military lawyer who had handled legal situations for the team before. Marcus gave him a 30-second summary. Willis said, "I know a civil rights attorney in Atlanta, Preston Okafor, 12 years handling cases against law enforcement in Georgia. I'll have him briefed and moving within the hour." The second call was to Supervisory Special Agent Dana Merritt of the FBI's Civil Rights Division in Atlanta. Merritt had worked adjacent to Marcus on a domestic extremism matter 4 years prior and knew exactly who he was. When he told her what had happened, the details, he had the timeline, the officer's name, the chief's name, she said, "I'll open a preliminary inquiry tonight. Send me the date, location, and officer name as a text." He did before dialing again. The third call was to Carol Hines, an investigative journalist at the Atlanta Chronicle, who had written 3 multi-part series on law enforcement misconduct in rural Georgia over 8 years. Marcus had never spoken to her. He found her number through a contact in 12 minutes. When she picked up, he introduced himself by name, rank, and unit, a disclosure he was not technically authorized to make, but which he calculated was operationally necessary. He said, "I need you to know that this story exists before anyone can make it disappear." She was typing before he finished talking. The fourth call was to Chief Glenn Varner's direct office line. He left a voicemail. It was polite. It was professional. It identified him by name and rank, stated the situation in factual terms, requested Estelle Mae Burgess's immediate release and the return of all her property. It noted that the matter was now documented and known to multiple parties with significant institutional interest. And it closed with a sentence that Glenn Varner would listen to 4 times over the following hours, trying to determine what exactly it was. Chief Varner, I want to be clear. I am not threatening you. I am informing you. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and I would encourage you to understand it before tomorrow morning. Marcus was in his car heading south 45 minutes after his mother's phone call. He drove through the Georgia night with the particular clarity of a man who has a destination and knows exactly what he will do when he arrives. Glenn Varner had run the Clanton Police Department for 22 years, and in 22 years, he had developed a reliable system for managing situations that could have become problems. The system worked because of several structural advantages Clanton had provided him, a city attorney. Connected enough to make lawsuits disappear before they became public. A city council with enough members who owed him professional courtesies. That budget oversight was more theoretical than actual. A local press with neither the staff nor the appetite for sustained investigative work, and a department culture built over decades in which the default response to any internal problem was absorption. Contain it, document it in the right language, pay what needed paying from the right budget line, and move forward. He had managed 16 complaints against Dale Pruett in 18 years using this system. 3 had required cash settlements. He had managed all 3. He had managed worse than this. He listened to Marcus Burgess's voicemail once, set the phone face down on his desk, called Pruett in. Pruett sat across from him with the ease of a man who had sat in that chair many times, and knew it meant a conversation, not a consequence. Varner told him, release the woman, return her property, and the incident report would reflect that she had appeared unsteady on her feet, lost her balance, and officers had attempted to assist. The shoplifting report was unconfirmed and cleared, the cruiser dashcam technical malfunction not recording, and the witnesses, Pruett said. Couple people on the sidewalk, Varner said. Nothing we need to worry about. What neither of them knew, Travis Holcomb's delivery truck dashcam had captured every second from across the street. Earl Simmons had been on his porch, had noticed Estelle's absence, had started making calls. One of those calls had reached his nephew Gregory, who had driven down from Atlanta and deployed through entirely legal means and publicly available technology, a method of capturing audio from a specific location, specifically from the frequency in use in Varner's office, that produced a recording of sufficient clarity for courtroom use. Gregory made this recording from a parked car on Commerce Street. The recording would not surface for 11 days, but it would surface. No charges, no explanation, no apology. The officer who walked Estelle to the front steps could not meet her eyes. She noticed this and filed it away because she was a woman who had spent 34 years noticing what people revealed when they thought they were invisible. She walked home. The 6 blocks took longer than usual. Knees stiff, left wrist throbbing, carrying everything herself, because the cart's wheel alignment had been knocked off when it hit the sidewalk. She passed Earl Simmons's porch. Earl was in his chair with his phone in his hand, and he stood up when he saw her, which he did not do easily, and walked down his porch steps, paying the full cost of each one. Estelle, he said, and the weight in that single word told her he already knew. I'm all right, Earl. He looked at the gauze on her knees. He looked at the way she held her left wrist slightly away from her body. He said, my nephew's already making calls. She didn't ask what calls. She would know soon enough. She went home, made tea, sat in her kitchen at the table where she had sat for 41 years, and let herself in the privacy of her own house, with no one watching, feel all of it. The indignity, the specific grinding pain of being 76 years old and decent and careful and dutiful, and having it mean nothing to a man who had decided before he spoke a word to her that it meant nothing. The loneliness of the holding room, the faces of the people on the sidewalk who had stopped and watched and had not intervened, not because they were bad people, but because they had made the calculation that people make when they are afraid of the thing they are watching. She felt all of it. She allowed herself that. Then she set it aside with the discipline of a woman who has spent 76 years in a world that did not always cooperate with who she was, and she thought about what came next. Then she called Marcus. He told her he was already on the road. She told him he didn't need to come. He said her name. She said, "Okay, baby." Frank Dillard had retired from government service 8 years prior, and now operated carefully and entirely within the law as a private intelligence consultant. He had worked in intelligence long enough to know that the people who inflated the description of what they did were usually compensating for something. He worked for clients with specific bounded needs law firms, preparing complex litigation corporations, conducting internal investigations, and on occasion, people like Marcus Burgess, who needed comprehensive information, assembled quickly and with total accuracy. Marcus called him from the road south of Atlanta at 11 that night. What Dillard assembled over the following 3 days using public records, court documents, data broker sources, archived news coverage, and professional contacts who owed him courtesies was a portrait of Dale Pruett and Glenn Varner that read like a ledger of accumulated damage, the kind that only becomes visible when someone looks for it with the specific intention of seeing everything. 16 use-of-force complaints against Pruett in 18 years. 13 reviewed internally and closed without finding a closure rate consistent with a review process producing predetermined outcomes. 3 settled out of court. Combined settlement payments exceeding $400,000 from the Clanton municipal budget under a line item labeled Community Relations Expenditures, a designation opaque enough to avoid scrutiny from anyone who didn't know what to look for. Each of the 3 settlements had been accompanied by non-disclosure agreements. All 3 complainants were Black residents of Clanton. All 3 were at the time of their incidents elderly, young, or in circumstances of financial vulnerability that made the settlement offer sufficiently attractive to sign. 2 of the incidents involved elderly residents. One involved a 19-year-old named Damon Reeves who had been stopped without justification on a Tuesday evening in 2015 and spent 4 days he is in the hospital. His family had signed the NDA after the city attorney. A man named Bruce Stell explained in the gentlest possible terms that the alternative was a legal process that would be expensive, and uncertain. Bruce Stell had handled all 3 settlements. His cousin Gary Stell sat on the Clanton City Council and served on the subcommittee that reviewed municipal budget expenditures, including the community relations line item. Glenn Varner had been present at 2 of the 3 settlement negotiations. He had not spoken much at either. He hadn't needed to. The machine was small, embedded, and quiet. It had run for years because the people it produced damage against lacked the resources or connections to make the damage visible. And because the structure surrounding it, the budget oversight, the local press, the internal review process, were not designed to find what they were not looking for. Marcus had spent his career in rooms where machines like this operated at much larger scale and with much more lethal consequences. He knew exactly where they were vulnerable. He thought about his mother's wrists and drove south through the dark. He turned onto Calder Road at 11:47 at night. He had driven 6 hours without stopping except for gas, and the particular clarity that accumulates over hours of sustained driving with a single purpose had resolved into something quiet and absolute by the time he made the final turn. The street was dark oak trees making a tunnel of shadow under the streetlights. Gerald's tree planted the year Marcus was born, now wider than Estelle could reach, was dark and enormous against the sky. He parked in front of the house. The porch light was on. It was always on when she was expecting him, even when she said he didn't need to come. She opened the door before he reached the top porch step. She always knew when he was coming some internal calibration to him that had existed since he was a boy, and that he had stopped trying to explain decades ago. She stood in the doorway in her house dress, with the gauze on her knees and her silver hair undone from its braid, falling around her shoulders. She looked smaller than the last time he had seen her, the way she always looked smaller than the last time, because memory preserved her in the context of the house, and the house was the same size, and she had been getting smaller inside it for years. In a way, he registered each visit as a new fact and spent the months between accommodating. They looked at each other for a moment in the doorway light. Then she stepped forward, and he put his arms around her. He had been doing this since he was 7 years old, and the specific geometry of it, her head against his chest, the way she settled into the embrace. The sound of her exhale was the most recognizable thing in the world to him. He was careful with her. He had always been careful with her because she had always been smaller than he remembered. "Let me see your wrists," he said. "They're fine, baby." "Mama." She held them out. The swelling at the left joint was visible even in the porch light, a slight asymmetry. The left larger than the right, the skin at the wrist line still showing the faint bruised marks of cuffs that had been too tight. He photographed both wrists carefully from 2 angles and sent the photographs to Captain Willis and to Preston Okafor's number within 60 seconds. Preston Okafor called back in 4 minutes. His voice was warm and measured the baritone of a man who spoke to people in difficult circumstances regularly, and understood that the quality of the voice itself was part of the communication. He introduced himself to Estelle directly by name before anything else, a small thing that Marcus noticed and respected because it established immediately that his mother was a person with agency and not a case to be managed. "Mrs. Burgess Preston said, I want you to know that you have done nothing wrong and that I want to help you. With your permission, I would like to formally represent you beginning tonight. We are going to document everything carefully. Tomorrow morning, I will file a formal complaint with the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council. And we'll have a full conversation about all your legal options. Does that sound acceptable to you?" Estelle looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at her and said nothing. It was her decision. "Yes," she said. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Okafor." He drove to the Clanton Police Department at 8 o'clock the following morning. He wore civilian clothes, dark trousers, a plain gray shirt, nothing that announced anything because he was not there to make a display. He carried his credentials in his jacket pocket, a clean notebook, and a pen. The desk officer was a young woman in her 20s who looked up when he came in and registered with the intuitive efficiency of people who work front desks in law enforcement buildings that this was not a routine visitor. He gave his name and rank and asked to speak with Chief Varner. She made a call. Varner, it turned out, was available. The chief's office was in the back of the building. Varner was behind his desk when Marcus was shown in, arranged into the posture of a man performing confidence. Leaning back slightly, hands visible on the desk surface, the deliberately unthreatening stance of someone signaling he has nothing to fear. He had done this many times. He extended his hand across the desk. Marcus shook it and sat without waiting to be offered the chair. He placed the notebook on his knee and the pen in his hand. "My mother is Estelle Mae Burgess," he said. "She was detained by Officer Dale Pruett yesterday morning on Calder Road. She was taken to the ground handcuffed and held without charges for over 2 hours. I'd like your account of what happened." Varner settled into his practiced register, measured concern. Institutional language, the cadences of a man who has performed this particular scene many times. He understood the gravity of the situation. He wanted to assure Colonel Burgess that all complaints were taken seriously. He was sorry if there had been any distress caused. He was sure that when all the facts were assembled, a clear picture would emerge. Marcus listened without interrupting. He wrote several things in the notebook. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and placed a single item on the desk in front of Varner. A still frame, printed on photo paper, from Travis Holcomb's dashcam. The image showed the sidewalk on Calder Road with perfect time-stamped clarity. Estelle Mae Burgess, face down on the concrete. Dale Pruett's knee against her upper back. The scattered groceries on the pavement. The butter beans in the gutter. Varner looked at it. His face did not do anything dramatic. Men like Varner had trained themselves out of dramatic reactions decades ago. But something happened in his eyes, a very slight adjustment. The specific recalibration of a man who has just understood that the foundation beneath his position is not what he believed it was. Marcus saw it. He had spent 29 years reading people in high-stakes environments, and he had become very good at identifying the exact moment someone understands they have miscalculated. This was that moment. He let the silence hold it. Varner opened his mouth. Colonel Burgess, I can assure you that the department will conduct a full— This is from a delivery truck dashcam parked across the street, Marcus said as if Varner had not spoken. The footage has been preserved in multiple locations and provided to the FBI's Civil Rights Division, to the civil rights attorney, now representing my mother, and to a journalist at the Atlanta Chronicle who is currently working on a story. He paused. The FBI has opened a preliminary inquiry. Varner's expression shifted, still controlled, but the performance was thinner than it had been 60 seconds ago. He placed his hands flat on the desk in front of him, a gesture that was meant to look steady and looked instead like a man bracing. I appreciate you bringing this directly to me, Colonel. I want you to know that if there was any wrongdoing by any officer of this department— Chief Varner, Marcus's voice was entirely level. He was not louder, not sharper, just completely, utterly without warmth. I want to be precise about something because I think precision matters here. He let the silence sit for 2 full seconds before continuing. My mother was carrying groceries home from the store she has shopped at for 31 years. She was carrying butter beans, a specific brand she buys every week because she keeps her son's corner of the pantry stocked, even though that son visits twice a year, because that is who she is. Another pause, shorter this time. She held out her receipt twice. Your officer refused to look at it twice, and then your officer put her on that sidewalk and laughed while she bled. He tapped the photograph once, a single quiet tap. That is the woman you decided was worth nothing. The room was very still. Varner's jaw tightened. The color in his face shifted, not dramatically, but enough. He looked at the photograph and looked away from it and looked back at it. He was a man who had spent 22 years controlling the narrative of everything that happened in his building, and he was watching the control slip in real time with no mechanism available to arrest it. The next time you speak about my mother, Marcus said, standing, it will be on the record. He picked up the notebook. He left the photograph on the desk. He walked out. Glenn Varner sat in his office for a long time after Marcus left. He picked up his phone and put it down 3 times. He thought about options and found that they were not there. He told himself the footage might not be as clear as it looked. He told himself this could still be managed. He was wrong on both counts, and some part of him, the part that had been doing this for 22 years and knew the variables, already knew it. Marcus drove that morning to Travis Holcomb's home, a small ranch-style house on the north side of Clanton, with a vegetable garden along the east fence and a tool shed whose open doors revealed organized shelves. Travis answered within 30 seconds of the knock, as though he'd been expecting someone. He was the size Marcus had imagined, broad and solid, with kind eyes behind wire-framed glasses and a Georgia Bulldog's cap over thinning hair. Marcus introduced himself and explained why he was there. Travis said, "Sir, I want you to know I saved that footage to 4 separate drives and my email account and my wife's email account the same afternoon. I called a lawyer that night and he told me to keep it safe and not give it to anyone until I knew who they were." He looked at Marcus steadily. "I know who you are." He handed over a USB drive. "The original is on the cloud account. Timestamps intact. Metadata's clean. I'll testify if it comes to that." Marcus thanked him. Travis nodded once, then said, not looking at Marcus, looking at the space past him toward the street, "My mother taught first grade in Bibb County for 27 years. He didn't explain what that meant or why he had said it. He extended his hand. Marcus shook it. Marcus drove to Atlanta that afternoon and sat in Preston Okafor's office for 3 hours, delivering everything: the USB drive, the photographs of Estelle's wrists, the complete written summary of Frank Dillard's research on Pruett's complaint history, and the settlement structure. Preston received it all with the focused efficiency of a man who has been briefed on a mission he is ready to execute. The story appeared on the Atlanta Chronicle's website at 6 o'clock in the morning, 4 days after the incident on Calder Road. Carol Hines had spent those 4 days working with focused, almost frightening efficiency, verifying dates, reviewing the dashcam footage frame by frame with the newspaper's photo editor, cross-referencing Pruett's complaint history with Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council records, confirming Marcus Burgess's rank through the Department of Defense Public Affairs Officer Marcus had specifically contacted for this purpose. The headline exclusive dashcam shows Clanton officers taking 76-year-old teacher to ground. Police claim camera malfunction. The piece was thorough and specific. It included still images from Holcomb's dashcam, Estelle reaching for her cart going down Pruett's knee on her back, the handcuffs, the groceries on the pavement, the butter beans in the gutter. It quoted Preston Okafor. It referenced Pruett's complaint history and noted that 3 prior incidents had resulted in out-of-court settlements paid from municipal funds. It named Pruett, named Varner, noted Estelle's son was an active-duty Army colonel, rank confirmed by the Department of Defense. By 9 in the morning, the story had been shared 40,000 times. By noon, the Associated Press had picked it up and distributed it to every major news organization in the country. By 3 in the afternoon, it was leading on NBC, CNN, and Fox News simultaneously, which requires a story with enough clarity and emotional directness to cut across the usual fractures in the national media landscape. A 76-year-old retired schoolteacher. Groceries on a sidewalk. Butter beans in a gutter. A Delta Force commander's mother. The story required no interpretation. It spoke entirely for itself. By evening, the second dimension had emerged. A veterans advocacy organization had issued a statement expressing serious concern for the family of an active-duty special operations officer. 3 United States senators had issued statements, 2 Democrats and 1 Republican from Georgia, which was the part of the political response that made it impossible to characterize as partisan. Inside the Clanton Police Department, the atmosphere shifted in the specific way of a building whose occupants all understand simultaneously that something irreversible is happening, and none of them is saying it out loud. Dale Pruett was removed from patrol the morning the story ran and placed on paid administrative leave. He went home. The police union called him. The conversation was shorter and cooler than the 3 prior conversations they'd had during complaint proceedings. Pruett noticed the temperature difference and spent a significant amount of time trying not to interpret it as accurately as he suspected he should. The phones at the front desk rang with a frequency no one in the building had experienced. Some calls were press, some were citizens who had their own accounts of Dale Pruett and were calling for the first time in the knowledge that someone might now be compelled to listen. Mayor Harold Finch held a press conference that collapsed when a reporter from WSB-TV Atlanta asked directly whether he had been aware of prior settlements involving Officer Pruett and whether city funds from the community relations budget had been used. His answer, 4 minutes of institutional language cycling through denial deflection and procedural hedging, landed none of them. A 17-second clip was shared millions of times by that evening. Bruce Stell retained private counsel on the second day. He stopped returning calls from anyone connected to the city, the department, or the mayor's office. Everyone who observed this interpreted it correctly and immediately. 2 city council members announced they would not stand for re-election. Both had served on the subcommittee that reviewed the community relations budget expenditures. On the 4th day after the incident, Shane Corley went home on his lunch break and called his father, a retired Fulton County building inspector named Ray, a man who had raised his son with the practical ethics of a career where cutting corners had visible consequences. Ray listened to his son describe what he had seen on Calder Road and what he had said and not done since. Then he said, "Talk to a lawyer before you do anything else." The lawyer told Shane after a 90-minute consultation that Shane would later describe as the most clarifying conversation of his young life that the legal landscape was as follows. The dashcam footage, the complaint history, the FBI and GBI inquiries together constituted circumstances in which his exposure was directly proportional to his continued silence. His continued silence made him an accessory to a cover-up of an assault. His truthful testimony, given voluntarily and early, was the only thing that could meaningfully separate him from the decisions Pruett and Varner had made. "The only thing that protects you right now," the lawyer said, "is the truth, and the sooner you tell it, the more it's worth." Shane drove back to the station that afternoon and walked into the Internal Affairs office. Lieutenant Barbara Sims, mid-50s. The particular composure of someone who has spent years hearing things that are uncomfortable to hear, looked at the young officer sitting down across from her with an expression that was equal parts professional attention and private relief. She turned on her recorder. Shane Corley confirmed everything. The dashcam footage was real and accurate. Pruett's aggression had not been precipitated by any threatening or resisting behavior from Estelle. She had reached for the cart he pulled from her grip, and that reach was the only thing that happened before the force was applied. There had been no specific confirmed shoplifting description that matched Estelle. The dispatch call had been vague. The identification of her as a matching suspect had been Pruett's determination made before he spoke a single word to her. Pruett on the radio back to the station immediately after the incident had described Estelle as belligerent and combative. Both words were false. Shane had known they were false when he heard them and had said nothing. The instruction to file the incident as Estelle, having lost her balance, had come from Varner through the sergeant on duty, passed down through the chain to everyone in the processing area. His voice broke once midway through when he said he had been thinking about his grandmother since the morning it happened and that he could not. His voice broke there, and Lieutenant Sims waited without filling the silence that he could not keep doing this. He submitted his resignation at the end of the statement. He was not required to. Nothing in his legal exposure required it. His lawyer had not suggested it. He did it because in the moral calculus of a 22-year-old discovering who he was at the cost of who he'd been trying to become, it was the only thing that felt true. When Marcus Burgess read the transcript of Corley's statement weeks later, obtained by Preston Okafor through Discovery, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said to Devin Webb, he did the right thing when it cost him something that mattered. Devin, who had heard Marcus assess a great many people over a great many years, noted that he did not say this kind of thing often or carelessly. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation opened a formal criminal inquiry on the 6th day after the incident on Calder Road. Charges under consideration: assault and battery under Georgia law, civil rights violations under federal statute. The FBI's Civil Rights Division confirmed a parallel federal inquiry the same day. Dale Pruett arrived at the Clanton Police Department at 7:48 the following morning. He had been coming in at this time for 18 years, and some routine in him had not adjusted to the new reality. He was met at the entrance by his direct supervisor and the assistant chief. They walked him to his desk and stood on either side of him while he collected his personal items. Then they walked him back to the parking lot. The cameras were there. Someone had tipped them, likely multiple someones. The footage showed Dale Pruett in a gray t-shirt and slacks, no longer in uniform, no longer wearing the badge, walking to his car in the parking lot of the department he had called home for 18 years, while cameras tracked him from 2 angles. He did not look at the cameras. He got in his car. He drove away. That footage ran on cable news for 7 hours. Glenn Varner resigned 6 days after the formal inquiries opened. His resignation letter was 3 paragraphs and cited the desire to allow the department to move forward without the distraction of his presence during a period of review. It was the language of a man who had spent 22 years controlling every narrative that emerged from his building, making one final attempt to control the narrative of his own departure. It did not work because by the time the letter was published, Gregory Simmons had already surrendered his recording to the GBI. The recording of Varner's office conversation with Pruett Varner, instructing the false incident report, declaring the dashcam a technical malfunction. The full 17 minutes and 44 seconds of it was ruled admissible by a federal judge after 11 days of legal examination regarding the chain of custody. The ruling was that the recording had been made from a location that did not constitute a protected private space under the relevant circumstances. When the recording was played in court, it did not require interpretation. Varner's voice was clear. The instructions were specific. The cover story was explicit. The casual confidence of 2 men who believed they were in a room where their words had no consequence echoed through the courtroom with a specific quality that the observers present would describe separately, and using nearly identical language as the sound of men who had done this so many times that they had stopped being careful. Bruce Stell accepted a plea deal shortly after the GBI inquiry opened. In exchange for his full cooperation and complete documentation of the settlement processes, every payment, every NDA, every budget transfer, the entire record of how city funds had been used to absorb consequences that should have accrued to Pruett and to Varner, he received a suspended sentence and was referred to disbarment proceedings by the Georgia State Bar. The settlement files were released by court order as a consequence of the civil litigation Preston had filed. 3 incidents, 3 families, over $400,000 from public funds, Non-disclosure agreements presented to vulnerable people at moments of particular vulnerability. A budget line labeled Community Relations that had funded all of it for years. Damon Reeves, 19 years old in 2015, when Pruett's encounter left him hospitalized for 4 days, 28 now, and living in Atlanta, had signed an NDA. He had not spoken publicly since. When Preston Okafor confirmed that the federal judge reviewing the case had noted the NDAs might be unenforceable, given the criminal conduct involved, Damon Reeves said, "I've been waiting 8 years for someone to tell me I was allowed to say something." He gave Carol Hines a full interview. His mother Renee sat beside him. Renee Reeves said, "They paid us money. We needed that money. We were struggling, and they knew we were struggling. That's how it works. They find the people who can't fight, and they buy them quiet, and they keep doing it to the next person." The next person had been Estelle Mae Burgess, but Estelle Mae Burgess had a son who could not be bought, could not be quietly absorbed, and had spent 29 years learning exactly how to dismantle machines built on silence. Dale Pruett was indicted on assault and battery under Georgia law and civil rights violations under federal statute. He turned himself in at the Clanton County Courthouse on a Thursday morning at 8 o'clock. The cameras were there. 2 separate media organizations had staked out the entrance since the indictment went public the night before. The footage showed Pruett arriving in a dark sedan, getting out, walking up the courthouse steps in the company of his attorney. His jaw was clenched. His face was the color of old brick. His hands, the cameras all noted. Several outlets noted this on the same broadcast independently. Were the same hands that had put the handcuffs on Estelle Mae Burgess 4 weeks prior. He did not look at the cameras. In the courtroom, where Varner's recorded voice was played during evidentiary proceedings, Estelle sat in the 4th row in the blue dress she wore to church on special Sundays, her silver hair in its braid, her hands folded in her lap. Marcus sat to her left, Preston Okafor to her right. The recording played through the courtroom speakers, Varner's voice casual and confident, constructing a false record with the ease of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. Estelle listened without looking away. She heard him describe her fall. The fall that was not a fall. The fall that was a deliberate choice made by a uniformed officer on a public sidewalk in the language of an accident. She heard him instruct its transformation into documentation. She did not look away. The trial lasted 4 days in federal court in Atlanta. The gallery was full every day with the specific and serious attention of people who understand they are witnessing something that matters beyond the courtroom walls. Former students of Estelle's were there. Earl Simmons was there in the 3rd row in his Sunday suit, having arranged a ride because he no longer drove distances. Travis Holcomb was there. Shane Corley was there not as a witness, but as a person who felt he owed his presence to proceedings he had helped make possible. The dashcam footage was played in full on the 2nd day. The courtroom was silent throughout. The jury watched Estelle reach for the cart. They watched Pruett's response to that reach. They watched her go down. They watched the groceries scatter. They watched his knee. They watched the handcuffs click into place. They watched Pruett stand up from her prostrate body, adjust his uniform, and walk away without looking back. Then the prosecution played the audio from the station break room. The jury heard Dale Pruett's voice, unhurried, amused entirely. Unaware it was being preserved, say 70-some-year-old woman giving me actual lip about probable cause. Had to put her down just so she'd listen. These people, man, they think a piece of paper means something out there. 2 jurors flinched. 1 looked away. The prosecutor paused the audio on the silence that followed Pruett's laugh, let it fill the room for 5 full seconds, then turned to face the jury and said nothing. He didn't need to. Damon Reeves testified on the 3rd day. He described his 2015 encounter with Dale Pruett in careful and specific detail, the deliberateness of a man who has had 9 years to organize the memory into its most truthful form. His testimony established the pattern the prosecution needed, not a single bad morning, but 18 years of choices made by a man who believed they would never be visible. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Guilty on all counts. The federal sentencing judge, the Honorable William T. Abernathy, 19 years on the bench in this district, said in the formal register of the federal bench before sentencing that Pruett had weaponized a public trust in service of his own need for dominance had done so repeatedly. With the protection of a structure that no longer existed to protect him, and that the consequence was commensurate with the full weight of what he had done. Pruett received a term of state prison time followed by federal supervised release. His appeal was filed and denied. Glenn Varner pleaded guilty in the month before his scheduled trial date. His attorney released a statement saying the decision was made in the interest of sparing the community and his family additional hardship, and that Chief Varner accepted full responsibility for his actions. The statement did not mention the recording, the thing that made a trial unwinnable, or the settlement documentation that made an isolated error defense impossible. He entered his plea in open court. Preston Okafor was there. Carol Hines was there. Damon Reeves and his mother Renee were there. Earl Simmons was there. Travis Holcomb was there. And Estelle Mae Burgess was there in the fourth row in the blue dress with her silver braid with Marcus to her left. The sentencing judge, the Honorable Patricia Hurd, many years on this bench, said she had never quite felt the weight of a case the way she felt this one. She sentenced Varner to a term of imprisonment and, in the language of the sentencing order, imposed a lifetime prohibition on his serving in any law enforcement or public safety capacity in any jurisdiction, effective immediately and permanently. He walked out of the courthouse in a gray coat. Several people who had observed Glenn Varner over the 22 years of his tenure as chief people, who had watched him at ribbon cuttings and council meetings and 4th of July photographs, described what they saw when he walked past them on those courthouse steps. They used the same word separately: smaller. He was a smaller man than the one who had walked into that building with the comfortable authority of a man in his own house. The specific smallness of him was not primarily physical. It was the smallness of a man from whom the structure he had used to make himself large had been completely permanently removed. The Clanton City Council, reconstituted by a special election, voted in their third session to establish a civilian police oversight board with full and unobstructed access to use-of-force reports, body cam and dash cam footage, and complaint records. The vote was 11-0. This proposal had been brought before the old council 3 times in the preceding decade and had not made it out of committee on any occasion. Preston Okafor filed the civil lawsuit against Pruett Varner, the City of Clanton Mayor Finch in his official capacity, and Bruce Stell in federal court. The complaint was 47 pages. Its specificity, the dashcam footage, the complaint history, the settlement records, the GBI findings, the FBI inquiry, the recording of Varner's voice, Shane Corley's sworn statement, made it the kind of civil filing that defense attorneys examine and then make calculations about the cost of contesting. The case settled months later. The amount was confidential. Estelle was not required to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which Preston had made a condition before negotiation began and which held throughout. When Carol Hines asked him about the outcome, Preston said it was appropriate. He said it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who means the word precisely. Estelle used a portion of the settlement to establish a scholarship at Clanton Elementary. In her late husband Gerald's name, it would be awarded annually to a third-grade student demonstrating exceptional intellectual curiosity and strength of character, because Estelle knew from 34 years of teaching that these were the 2 qualities that opened every door, and that they could be found in children whose circumstances gave no outward indication of them, which was the entire point. The first cohort of recipients was announced at a ceremony in the school gymnasium, the same gymnasium where Estelle had chaperoned science fairs and holiday concerts, and the particular chaotic joy of elementary school events for 3 decades. She stood at the podium and presented each child with a certificate and a handshake, firm and direct, the way she had always shaken children's hands, because she believed you shook a child's hand the way you'd shake an adult's, with full attention and full respect, because children felt the difference and they remembered it. 3 weeks after the incident on Calder Road, on a Tuesday evening in September, Marcus returned to Calder Road. He had been going back and forth between Fort Bragg and Clanton during the proceedings, sleeping in his old room with the baseball pennant still on the wall that Estelle had never taken down, eating at his mother's table and being available for whatever the next phase required. His commanding officer had given him wide latitude appropriate for a colonel of his record dealing with a family situation of this severity, and Marcus had used it without waste. He came in through the front door at 6:30 and found his mother at the kitchen table. Her chair, the one facing the window where she had sat for 41 years, and she was in it with a legal pad covered in her careful, practiced cursive. The handwriting of a woman who had taught penmanship for 3 decades even, and unhurried, the kind she described as the only form of writing that showed proper respect for the person reading it. He came around to look and saw that she was writing letters, not to lawyers or journalists or council members. She was writing to the other families, to Renee Reeves and her son Damon, to the 2 other families whose cases had surfaced in the investigation and whose names and addresses Preston had provided with their permission, because they had asked to be connected with Estelle, and Estelle had said yes immediately, without needing to think about it. She was not writing about the lawsuit or the indictments or the settlement. She was writing in her careful cursive to say, "I see you. I am sorry this happened to you. You are not alone." Marcus sat in his father's chair, Gerald's chair, the chair that had been at this table in this position for as long as Marcus could remember, and he watched her write. He said nothing. She wrote, and the only sounds were the pen on the paper and the settling of the old house and the faint traffic from Calder Road outside. "You know," Estelle said without looking up from the page, "when they had me in that holding area, before they gave me back my phone, I kept thinking about my students, about how many of them I had tried to give something, some sense of their own worth, some dignity, some foundation to stand on." She paused and set the pen down and looked at her hands, the left one still slightly swollen at the wrist joint in a way the doctor said would take another month to fully resolve. "And then the world does what it does," she said, "and you wonder if any of it held." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "It held in me," he said. She looked up at him. Something moved across her face that held both of the things that were true simultaneously, not quite a smile, and not quite tears, but containing both of them somewhere underneath the way a river contains its sources. She looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't have to come all the way down here," she said. "Mama!" He looked at her steadily, with the same attention he gave to everything that mattered. "I've gone to places that don't have names. I've done things I'll never be able to tell you about, because you wouldn't sleep again if I did. The thing I would crawl through fire for is sitting at this table in September, writing letters to people she has never met to tell them that they're not alone." A pause. "There was nowhere else I was going to be." She picked up her pen. "A moment later, your father would have done the same thing." "I know," Marcus said. "He'd have been prouder of the letters than of any of the rest of it." Marcus thought about this about Gerald, at this table about his father, who had planted the oak tree in the year Marcus was born, who had been in every measure that Marcus had come to understand as genuinely significant a good man. "He would have been right," Marcus said. She wrote the rest of the letter. He sat across from her and let the evening move at its own pace and did not ask it to go faster. There is a photograph of them taken by Earl Simmons on a Sunday morning in October, 6 weeks after the incident on Calder Road. Earl had become more attentive to his phone since the incident, more aware of its specific utility as a documenting instrument, and he was sitting on his porch in the morning, as he always was, watching the street with the watchfulness of a man who has spent years doing it and understands its value. He saw the front door of Estelle's house open and raised his phone. Marcus was wearing a dark jacket and civilian trousers. Estelle was in her church coat, the good one, the navy blue she wore on the Sundays. She considered particularly important silver buttons, and her silver hair was in its braid, and she was holding her Bible in her left hand. Marcus was carrying it in his right. He had, as she stepped off the porch, simply taken it from her, without asking, because it was the kind of thing that needed no conversation, and they were walking side by side toward Greater Refuge Baptist Church, 2 blocks east. In the photograph, Estelle is talking. She is making a point, her free hands slightly raised with the particular gesture she used when explaining something she considered important. Marcus is looking at her, with his whole body oriented toward her. Not just his head, but his shoulders and posture, the physical equivalent of complete attention, the attention of a man who has been listening to this woman since he was old enough to understand that listening to her was worth his full capacity. The morning light is coming through the old oak trees that line both sides of Calder Road, Gerald's tree, and the others 50 and 60 and 70 years old, planted by the street's original owners, and the light is doing something soft and generous with the oak leaves in the September morning, the kind of light that makes everything look illuminated from within rather than from above. Earl sent the photograph to Marcus that afternoon. Marcus sent it to Devin Webb. Devin Webb had been beside Marcus in places whose names are classified in operations, whose details cannot be described in circumstances that would make this story look, as Devin himself would later say, like a quiet afternoon. He was a man who had seen Marcus make decisions under conditions of extreme danger that most people would find impossible to describe accurately, let alone to make. He had been beside Marcus in the specific way that men are beside each other in those circumstances, the proximity that creates its own understanding. He looked at the photograph. He didn't say anything to anyone about it. He looked at it for a while, and then he picked up his phone and sent 3 words back to Marcus. That's the mission. Adrian Pemberton was appointed Chief of Police of the Clanton Police Department 8 months after Varner's resignation, following a national search conducted by the reconstituted City Council, with input from the new Civilian Oversight Board. She came from the Atlanta Police Department's Community Accountability Unit, where she had spent 6 years building a program that had been studied by departments in 4 other states. 44 years old, with the quality of authority that comes from knowing what you are doing and not requiring external validation of that knowledge. She had a reputation for running a department where accountability was not an aspirational value, but an operational requirement, which meant it was a department where officers who could not or would not meet that requirement did not stay. She described what she was doing in Clanton in her first staff meeting as a rebuild. Not a reform implies the structure is sound and requires adjustment. The structure of the Clanton PD had not been sound in any of the ways that mattered. A rebuild, starting from the standard, setting it clearly, measuring everything against it without exception. Several officers resigned in the months following her appointment, some voluntarily, some following internal reviews of their conduct histories. New officers were hired through a process that included community interviews and explicit discussion of what the new policies meant and why they existed. Body cameras became mandatory on all patrol shifts. Dashcam footage was subject to automatic cloud upload and retention for a minimum of 3 years, with deletion requiring a written court order, a policy change that required IT infrastructure modifications. Adrian pushed through the City Council in her second month over the objections of 2 members who were, as she put it privately, not going to be a problem for long. They were not. Neither stood in the next election. The culture change was slower. Culture is always slower than policy, because policy changes the rules and culture changes. The people take time and consistent demonstration and the willingness to show repeatedly and without exception that the rules mean what they say. Adrian Pemberton had patience for it because she had done it before and because she understood that the alternative, allowing the culture to persist while the policies changed around it, produced the cosmetic accountability that looks correct from outside and is hollow from within. Estelle Mae Burgess attended the Civilian Oversight Board meetings at Clanton City Hall on the 3rd Tuesday of every month without fail. She sat in the back row. She did not speak often. She had not been appointed to the board she attended as a citizen, which was a right she exercised with the same consistency she applied to every commitment she made. But she was there, which meant something in itself, the presence of a woman who had been put on the ground on a public sidewalk and who had refused to let that be the last word about what Clanton was or what it could become. Adrian Pemberton was asked in an interview with Georgia Public Radio about her tenure and the department's transformation, what the most significant influence on the change had been. She took a moment before answering. She did not name Pruett's conviction. She did not name the federal investigation, or the new policies, or the personnel changes, or the civilian board. An elderly woman, Adrienne said, who knew who she was before they put their hands on her, and kept knowing it after. That is harder to be than anything this job has ever asked of me. Dale Pruett was convicted on all Halshifeld's counts and is serving his sentence. Glenn Varner pleaded guilty and will never hold a badge or any position of public authority again. Bruce Stell was disbarred. Harold Finch did not seek re-election. The machine that protected them, the settlements paid from public funds, the sealed files, the false reports, the quiet payments made to people who couldn't afford to refuse that machine is gone. It was dismantled not by one dramatic event, but by an accumulation of ordinary people doing the right thing at the right moment. A delivery driver who kept his dashcam running, a neighbor who noticed an absence and made calls, a young officer who walked into an internal affairs office and told the truth when telling it. Cost him something real. A journalist who answered a cold call from a stranger because the story was real and mattered, an attorney who called Estelle Mae Burgess by her name on her first night home and asked her permission before he proceeded, and a 76-year-old woman who, in a holding room with scraped palms and a swollen wrist, asked for the phone she was entitled to and made one call. Estelle Mae Burgess still walks 6 blocks to Beaumont's grocery every Tuesday morning. Same canvas tote bags, faded green. Same route she has walked for 31 years. Same ritual she maintained through Gerald's illness and passing through 34 years of third-grade classrooms, through everything the world arranged and rearranged around her. She still buys a bag of dried butter beans every Tuesday, the specific brand Marcus has preferred since he was 17, because she keeps his corner of the pantry ready the way she always has, with the particular faith of all mothers who hold a designated space for the children who have grown and gone, believing they will come back. She keeps her receipt in the left breast pocket of her coat. She has kept every receipt for 43 years. The walk is hers. The sidewalk is hers. It always was. Clanton knows it now. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that accountability is real, that truth endures, that a 76-year-old woman with scraped palms and one phone call can bring down a machine that ran for years, share it right now. Put it in front of someone who needs to hear it. Hit the like button, and please subscribe our channel, because there are more stories like this one, and they deserve to be told. The Estelles of this world deserve witnesses. B1. Justice is not always swift, but it is stubborn, and it always has somewhere to be.